In this video, we are going to talk about a new feature of Entity Framework Core 6, and that is being able to use temporal tables. The idea of temporal tables is to have a history of all of the changes of the data of a table. Basically, it is about saving every single change of every single row of the data of the table. In Microsoft official documentation, they show us this illustration, which allows us to see how this works. Basically, we will have a temporal table, which is the one that has the current version of the data. Meanwhile, we have a history table, which is the one that contains the different changes of the data that resides in the temporal table. Then, when we make an update or a deletion in the temporal table that contains the actual data, then automatically the history table will be updated. After that, we can make queries against these history tables of our entities. We will be able to, for example, see the changes that a specific record got from a date to another date. Also, we will be able to reestablish a record that has been deleted. Let's see this. We are here in Visual Studio. This is a small .NET 6 console application. I already set up the minimum to have it working. We are going to use SQL Server. As you can see here, I have installed Entity Framework Core SQL Server, and I also created a application DB context which inherits from DB context, and I have this on configuring, in which I am using the use SQL Server, and I am passing a connection string. And I have this people DB set and this person entity, which has three properties: ID, name, and age. So as you can see, this is a simple model. Now let's say that I want to configure the people table as a temporal table, which means that it will have a history table in which we are going to record every single change that occurs in the data of the people table. We can do that by using the Fluent API. So let me say here, override on model creating, and below the on model creating, we are going to say model builder.entity. We are going to put here person, then to table. Here we need to put the name of the table, and as a second parameter, we can have some configuration. I can say options, and then I will say options is temporal. And that's actually it. With this single line of code, I am configuring the fact that we want to have all of the changes of the data in the history table of the people table. Now let me add a migration. Let's go to the Package Manager console and let me say add migration initial. And you are going to see in the migration that we have this configured as a temporal table. As you can see here, we have annotation, SQL Server is temporal, and we also have these two new properties here, period end and period start. And what they do is that they let us know from when to when did a record has a specific value. For example, let's say that the person with ID 1 has its name as Felipe from February 5, 2021 all the way through May 7, 2021. So as you can see with this, we can know from when to when what value did a record had in a specific date, in a specific point in time. So that is what this period end and period start do. So now let me push these changes to SQL Server. Let me say update database here, and that is done. Now we can go to SQL Server Management Studio. Let me expand on databases and let me look for my database, which is called Temporal Tables EF Core. Let me expand on this, expand on tables, and then as you can see, we have the people table, and not only that, but it says that it is system version, which means that this is a temporal table. And if we expand on here, we are also going to see that we have people history, which is the history table of this temporal table. If I right click on it and select top 1000 rows, you are going to see that it is a normal table with these 3 columns and these 2 extra columns for the period end and period start. And not only that, if I right click on the history table and select top 1000, you are going to see that again we have the exact same schema. It is important that they both have the same schema because we need to be able to take data from the people table to the people history table. Now let's play with this. Let's go to Visual Studio, let's go to the program class. I will go to the program class and let me put this hello world in the end, and I want to say using bar context, we're going to start by creating a new record, application db context control dot to import this namespace, and then I'm going to say bar Felipe equal to new person, and then we're going to say here name Felipe and age, let's say 99, semicolon here, then context add Felipe, and finally context save changes. Now let me press Ctrl F5 to run our application, and it has finished, so we can go to the database and we're going to see something. We're here in the history table, right? I will run this query and you are going to see that we don't have anything here in the history table. This is because we just created a record, but it has no history because no changes has been applied to it. But if we go to the people table, we're going to see that indeed we have Felipe here. That is fine, and also see that we have values in period end and in period start. In period start, we have from when this record has had this version, these values here. And it says period end year 1999 because this is the current version of the data, so that is why it has the datetime max value. Now something that I like to do is to exchange these 2 columns because I like to see the start at the left and the end at the right, and I will do the same for this one just so it is easy to see the data that we're going to see in the next example. Now for the next example, I will copy this ID from here and I will go back to Visual Studio and I will say var ID equal to new git. I just want to have this at hand because we're going to use it several times. I will say, instead of new person, I will say context people first or default, and I will say xid equal ID, which is this ID that we have here. Then I will change the value of name. I will say Felipe2, semicolon here, and then Felipe age 999, semicolon here. I will remove this add and I will leave this save changes. Now I will press Ctrl F5 to run our application one more time and you're going to see that it has finished, so we can go to SQL Server Management Studio and we're going to see that here in the people table we have the change being applied. That is fine, but what I wanted to show you, what is so good about temporal tables is that now this people history table will have the previous version of the data. As you can see here, we have name Felipe, which was the previous value of this record, and also age 99. And you're going to see something else. You're going to see that period start has a value, but also period end. And it says here that this version of the data was live for about 2 minutes, from the minute 51 to the minute 53. So as you can see, you can know from when to when this value was in the temporal table, which is amazing because with this you can have an audit of all of the records of all of the temporal tables of your database. And this is completely done automatically by SQL Server. And what is also good about this is that it is 100% transparent from the Entity Framework Core view. I didn't have to do anything here to say that we wanted to populate the history table. What we did was to just update the record and SQL Server manage the rest. Now, something that I want to do is that I want to do several changes. So let me put this here. I will delete Felipe H from here, this line of code, because I don't really need it. And I will say here, await task delay. And let's say, for example, 1 second, semicolon here, and I will repeat this code several times, 4, 5, 6, and actual. So I will say here 3, 4, 5, 6, and here I will put actual or current. And this is fine, so as you can see, I will be modifying my name several times, and I will be waiting 1 second between each operation, and that's it. So now let me press Ctrl F5 to run this. This is going to take about 5 seconds, but as you can see, it has finished. So let's go back here, and now let's go back to SQL Server Management Studio. Let's go to the people table first, and you can see that we have Felipe Actual here, which is fine. But if we go to the people history table, and I press F5, you are going to see that we have now each version of the Felipe record here. We have Felipe 2, all the way through Felipe 6. And not only that, but here we have from when to when this record had this value in the temporal table. So now that we have all of this data here, let's learn how to query it. Let's go to Visual Studio and let me delete this. All of this, I want to delete all of this, and I will say people and then context people to list. I just want to do a simple to list of the people DB set to see what do we get. Let me say here for each var person in people, let me say people here, and then I will say console right line, and here I will say name. Here I will say person.name, and then age, person age. We're just seeing what values do each people have. So let me say Ctrl F5 to run our application, and we're going to see that we only have one record, which is Felipe Actual, of course, because what we're doing here is that we are querying the person entity, and this is being translated to a query into the people table. But what if we want to also query the people history table? Well, for that we can do the following. We can use several methods here, several functions that will allow me to query that history table. The first one that we're going to see is called Temporal all. And let me invoke this function, control dot, to bring Microsoft Entity Framework Core namespace. With temporal all, we are going to bring not only the data in the people table, but also the data in the people history table. Let's see that. Let me press Ctrl F5 to run our application, and we're going to see that here we have Felipe Actual, which comes from the people table, but also we have all of the records that come from the people history record, which is fine, but there is something we are missing here. We are not getting the period start and period end values. So let's fix that. Let me close this, and what we are going to do is the following. I will go to person, and here I will add to properties, let's say for example valid from and datetime valid to. In Entity Framework Core 6, these values can't be equal to the name of the columns that you have here, so be careful with that. Now let me say here not map, control dot to bring this namespace, and let me paste that here. Now what I will do is that I will project these values from here to these properties here. So let me go to the program class, and in this query I will say select, and I will project to a new person, and then in here I will say ID equal to X ID, name X name, age equal to X age, and then for valid from and valid to, we're going to get the information of the underlying shadow property, that is period start and period end. So let me come here and let's say ef.property of type datetime, and then I will say, and let me delete this and put this parenthesis here. So I will say here the entity, which is X, and then the property name, which is period start. And I will do the same for valid to. Let me say here valid to, and here we're going to say period end. And now with this, we're good to go. I can actually put here, for example, valid from, and then let me say person valid from, let me say, I put people here should be person, so valid from, and then finally valid to, and person valid to. Alright, so let's give this a test. And as you can see here, we have not only the values of the records, like Felipe and Felipe 2, but we also have from when they were valid and until when they were valid. Like this one took about 2 minutes, and this one was for like almost 1 minute, 1 second, and so on. So let me close this and let's see something else. Let's say that before I close this, let's say that I want to order by descending by this period end value that we have here. Let's do that. Let me come here, and here I can say order by descending, and let me say here this same EF property that we have here, this shadow property that we have here, and that's it. With this we can press Ctrl F5, and we're going to have now these values like this. Notice something, notice that we have Felipe 6 here, but we have Felipe actual first. That is because I said valid to, I'm ordering by valid to in a descending manner, and this one has the max value of datetime. Therefore, this will always be the first one, but we have Felipe 6 as the second record being displayed here, which is the most recent one in the history table, which is great. Now, let's do the following, and by the way, I should be doing an ID equal to ID. I should be saying here where x.id equal to ID. This is working anyway because we only have one record, but in production you are going to have a lot of data. Therefore, it is good practice to use this where clause. Now, what if instead of bringing every single record here, we only bring the one record that was actual in a specific point in time? We can do that. We can say here temporal as of, and here I can pass a new date time, and I can pass then a moment in time in which I want to know which version of the data was actual, was the current version. We can do that. Let me put here a moment in time, December, today is 10. Now let me come here to SQL Server Management Studio, and let me, for example, try to get this one, Felipe 3. So this is 1956, so 1956, and then now I need to pick a value between these ranges of time. So I can choose 42, because this is 42.8. If I choose 42.0, then it is going to be contained within this range of dates. So let me put here 42. And now let's press Ctrl F5 to run our application. And you are going to see that now we only have Felipe 3 here, which means that indeed I can know what value did this record have at any point in time. And not only that, I can pass a range. For example, let me say, instead of temporal as of, let me say temporal from to, and now I can pass a from and a to. For example, let me say here, or let me say here better, from, and let me put this here just so that the code is more clear, and then a to here. Now let me say from and to, and now let me pick another value here. Let's say, for example, 44, and then between these 2 seconds, let me press Ctrl F5, and we're going to see that between these 2 seconds, the values of our record were Felipe 3, Felipe 4, and Felipe 5. And we have here, of course, the valid from and valid to values that allows us to see that this is indeed the case. But let's be clear to know what does temporal from to does. What temporal from to does is that it allows you to know which values were active between these from and to parameters. But what if you don't want exactly that? What if what you want is to know which values are contained in this range of time that we have here? We can use temporal contain in. This means that we want to know which values have their period start after this from here and their period end before these 2 values that we have here. So which versions of the data are totally contained between this range of values that we have here. Let me go to SQL Server Management Studio to pick a good value. Something like 45 will be fine for the second. Let me come here and let's say 45, and we're going to see something, and then we're going to explain this result. As you can see, we have Felipe 5 and Felipe 4. Why is that? Okay, so let me close this and let's see that. We have 42 and 45 here, right? So let's go back here and let's see this. As you can see here, Felipe 3, for example, has its period start in 56 second 41. Okay, second 41 is before this 42 that we have here. Therefore, it is not entirely contained in this range of dates that we have here because it started before this from value that we have here. Now, if we go all the way through Felipe 6, we're going to see that here we have that the period end for Felipe 6 is 45. 45.8. Oh, okay, so it is 45.8, which means that it is after these 2 that we have here. So it is also not entirely contained in this range of dates that we have here. That is why Felipe 6 was omitted from the result set, and also Felipe 3. We only had Felipe 4 and Felipe 5 because those were the only 2 records that were entirely contained in this range of dates that we have here. Now finally, for our final example, what I want to do is to delete our record and then recreate it from the history table. So let me delete this. Let me delete all of this, and now let me say here var Felipe equal to context people first. We only have to say first because we only have 1 person in the database. So context remove Felipe and context save changes. Alright, so let's press Ctrl F5. And as you can see, this has been successful, and therefore we should not have the Felipe record in the temporal table. But before we see that, let's see in the history table that we have Felipe actual. Because Felipe actual is here, it means that it is not in the people table anymore. Let's go back to the people table and let's see that we indeed do not have Felipe actual here. But let's say that that was a mistake. Let's say that we want to have Felipe back here, actual Felipe here, or Felipe actual, actually. So let's come here and let's see how we can do that. What we can do is to say here temporal all, And then I can say where, let me use my ID because I want to make sure that I only get one of the Felipe records from the history table. Now, if I want the most recent one, the most recent version of Felipe, then I can order by period end and I can get the max value. So for that, we're going to say order by descending. And when I say the max value, I mean the highest value of them all. So let me say here EF property because I need to get the value of the shadow property. Then we're going to say period end and finally first. So we are getting the most recent version of Felipe. Now after that, I will say add because I want to add Felipe. And let me put this as uppercase. And that should be it. Let me press Ctrl F5. And we're going to see that everything was successful. And if we go to here, and let's go to the people table, we are going to see that we have Felipe actual here back. And that is great. And let me just say something before finishing. Let's say that I want to bring back Felipe 3, for example. There is nothing wrong with that. You can bring Felipe 3 back, or Felipe 5, or whatever. You can choose whatever version of the data that you want to have back in the temporal table, and you can do it. You can do it in the same manner that we did this. You can get a record in a query and then just add the record and say save changes. So as you can see, Entity Framework Core 6 allows us to use the temporal tables of SQL Server in a really easy manner. Thank you.